This is Bob Roark with Business Leaders Podcast, and today we have Mike Dill. Mike Dill's a partner with Holland Hart, a firm he's located out of Denver. He's a corporate M&A securities startup specialist in the legal arena. Mike, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invitation, Bob.
Absolutely. You know, given the COVID pandemic and some of the, I guess, earth-changing or seismic shifts in the business climate, I thought it was particularly useful to bring Mike on and talk about some of the issues that might be facing business owners. And, you know, what we hope to cover today, so you guys have an idea of what's coming, is we're going to talk about what do you do about staying compliant, or being aware of the state, local orders and directives, talking some of the issues that may be facing you in the HR side of the house. You know, as far as some of the things that you need to be keeping in mind with as you're either continuing or resuming operations, whether it's supply chain issues, new business lines, and so on, talking a little bit maybe about if you've got outstanding lines or loans, financing issues, you know, what do you do about those and how do you take and provide? And then there's a fair amount of concern or shifting landscape on some of the government relief programs, in particular PPP. So we've got Mike on. We're going to go through them so you guys can know what you're looking forward to in the episode. Mike, why don't we start out a little bit with kind of how you got here and who you serve?
That'd be great. So I act as outside general counsel for a lot of my companies that are clients. And what that means is they're smaller companies. They can either be growing in a variety of industries, tech, manufacturing, services, but they don't have a lawyer that's basically on staff, right? So they have a firm that they can call to get a lot of their questions answered. So yes, I will help with people when they sell their companies. I will help people raise debt and equity financing. But for a lot of my clients, I get asked all kinds of everyday questions, which is I've got an employee that reported me to the police because I'm still operating when I've got a stay-at-home order that's going on, which is a real client, a real situation. So what I do is I kind of am the quarterback of a team at my firm, so I can pull in specialists that are very well versed in very specific issues, right, in employment, tax, et cetera. But a lot of the questions I can answer as just an outside general counsel. So I help my clients navigate the variety of legal issues that are facing their businesses today. So, which is a lot right now.
You know, I thought we would try to drill down. And so, you know, as we go through the categories, you know, and I can imagine the quantity and volume of questions from the clients due to the level of uncertainty. So how do the customers, or how should they be thinking about the directives from, you know, either municipality or state government?
Well, I think the first thing, and this may be obvious, but it's worth stating, is these are not optional directives, right? A lot of people have different levels of concern over this coronavirus and the pandemic and the way that it's affecting their business. But you can't just choose to just disregard them. And I think there are some people that are a little bit more aggressive in their interpretation of the directives and orders than others. But what I mean by that is you actually need to just be aware of them. And like you mentioned, Bob, they're changing very rapidly. Even at the state level, when orders have been in place for a long period of time, they're still changing every 4 weeks, right? We're in a different phase. And I've seen some planned expansion of orders because we're in level 2, right? We already did level 1. We're in the middle of level 2. There's going to be a level 3 and there's going to be a level 4. And then there may be a new normal, right? It's not going to be back to the old normal. So each of these different levels is going to have different requirements, and people are really navigating a lot of them now because there's some companies like my firm, for example, that we're not back in the office yet. Even though we could be, we've chosen to continue to have people work remote because we can, and it's safer, while we put the procedures in place that are going to protect employees and our customers if they would choose to come to our offices. So I would start at the state level, and I would start there and then drill down at the county level or the city level, depending on where your operations and business offices are, because a lot of the state and local, or a lot of the county and local directives are built off of what's being released by the state or just defer to the state.
You know, and shifting gears a little bit and thinking toward the HR side of the house, you know, HR is already a topic of interest and remains a topic of interest. And now there's going to be a shifting landscape, I think, due to what policies and procedures do you have in place, depending on whichever level you're in, bringing people back and keeping them safe with the COVID crisis. So what are your thoughts about that?
So for companies that were proactive, that put in place new policies, I think those, and our firm did, for example, but those policies were probably put in place late March rather quickly. My guess is on a shorter term basis than this pandemic is turning out to be. So I think you should make sure that you're evaluating those, one, just as you transition employees back to work, to make sure those policies still work, and two, to see if they're going to work for the duration of honestly, there's the combination of time where people are going to probably work remote and work in the office, given that most non-essential businesses can only have 50% of their workforce in the office at this time. So I would just, first, you got to dust them off, get familiar with them, make sure they're going to work for the longer period of time. Second, I think you need to be thinking about how do we, and if you didn't put in place those policies, which a lot of companies did not, how do our existing policies work with this new environment? And are they going to work for the long run? And to be honest, you need to think about whether they're covering the situations that are coming up on a daily or a weekly basis with your employees. So one question that we've heard a lot is, I have employees that don't feel safe at work. I mentioned the client of mine that had somebody that called the cops on the company, and the client was in directive with the governor's order. The employee didn't really want to work, and so he thought this might be his way to not have to work. He didn't think that he couldn't get fired for that, which was interesting perspective. But the point behind that example is that there are going to be employees that don't feel safe, right? And so how are you addressing those questions when they come up from your employees? What type of additional procedures are you putting in place? Now, that's beyond HR, but it does involve HR as well. So,
and I think about that, so as far as as an employee, you're healthy, right? And so you're compliant and you're doing what you need to go to work, and somewhere midday or somewhere along the way you go, I feel less well, and I, and so on. And, for the business owner, you go, so if you have a policy, what's the challenge or issue about making sure that you're compliant with your own policy?
Well, it's a good question. You need to be basically just enforcing it equally among your employees, right? So and this is how sort of life has changed underneath employment laws with the pandemic, right? But one of the things that you can put in place now is basically, if you're sick, you can't come to work, right? Or if you get sick at work, you have to leave work, right? It sounds like common sense, but you can do that as long as you can force employees to go home, right? As long as they're in danger of getting other employees or getting customers sick, right? And that's something that you need to be doing consistently. It actually reminds me of a situation another client of ours had, which is, they've been doing the guidelines correct. They've had mandatory testing when employees check in at work and when they check out at work. They test, take the thermometer across the forehead, check their temperature. Well, one of the persons that was doing that was friends with another employee. The employee had been furloughed, hadn't worked for a while, really needed the job, failed the test, but convinced his friend that was doing the testing to write down, to basically change the results so that he was in compliance. Worked full day and felt sick, so ended up working that day, coming in the next day and working only a few hours and having to go home, right? Both of these days, the results were doctored. And then the person, which this is what slays me, came in a third day and doctored, the results again. And basically there was a huge risk of getting other employees sick. As far as they know, they weren't any other employees that were sick. So that's the good news, right? But the point of all of this is, you can have great policies, but you need to make sure your employees are complying with them, right? And of course, these employees weren't. Then the employer, had to make the decision about whether to terminate, which they had the ability to do, but all because, and understandably so, with people not having a lot of work, they were wanting to work, but they just really couldn't. There's too much risk. And the fact that you're lying to your employer, right, was definitely good enough cause to let these employees go. So,
I think about that employer going, so I brought my workforce back. We've managed to navigate, this pretty well. We've got our policies and procedures in place, and yet I have an asymptomatic worker come in and get another at-risk worker ill. What's my risk as a business owner?
So there is real risk, right? There's a causation issue here that no one has the answer to, and that's being debated about what do we do, right? But if you can prove, right, or make it very likely that they were transmitted on your premises, right, as an employer, you may have liability, right, for not providing a safe work environment. And that's underneath a variety of federal and different state employment laws and statutes. So that's the real risk, right, is that some employee would bring a claim against you as a business owner for not providing a safe work environment. There's additional risk if you don't do it correctly with current directives about, 50% employer mandatory testing for certain industries, right? There's additional risks of violating the law, so you could have state agencies or even federal agencies that can bring claims too.
I think about all this testing and thermometers and health checks, and all I can think of in the back of my mind is HIPAA. And I go, where does HIPAA ever creep into here?
Yeah, you can. You obviously can't share that information about employees' health with, HIPAA does come into play here, right? But you can still use HIPAA within your business, right? Because you're not really using the medical information as if you were like a medical provider, right? You're basically just logging and keeping the information as you're required to do so underneath the state directive. So you can't share it with third parties, right? But you can use it within your organization to make decisions about this, right? Whether to send employees home or not.
As thinking about that, so I'm that business owner, it says I'm ready to try to get restarted and get my operation going. So I've got my policies and procedures sorted out. I've got my testing sorted out, and says, but I can't, cover all my bases. So I would like to try to reach out to my insurance team and ask, how do I take and offset my risk with an insurance product, tool, or whatever? What does that discussion look like?
Well, I would wish you the best of luck in that conversation. As far as I know, I haven't had clients that have had luck in getting those types of claims, covered, to be honest. And there's general carve-outs with most CG&I policies that deal with things like pandemics, right? So a good friend of mine's an insurance broker with Locked In, and he basically said they had a lot of calls early on in this pandemic saying like, this is great, right? I've got coverage if anything goes on. And he said they had a lot of hard conversations with their providers. So unfortunately, there's not a lot of insurance as far as I'm aware of to purchase to offset some of those risks. Now, there are larger conversations going on about trying to introduce bills to protect employers. So basically new law that if you're operating in compliance with all of this federal, state, local directives for your business, you shouldn't have liability, even if somebody does get sick. So I've been following those conversations, and I think there's a chance that those may become law. They're getting a little bit more traction, but right now it's really just just conversations, just proposals.
It amidst everything else that a business owner has coming their way, I think about the continuing operation in the new normal is going to be an interesting exercise. And so, in thinking about that, as we're going to go back out and, hopefully communications with our existing customers have been going along normally as typical, what types of things do you think they should be thinking about when they're talking to not just their customers, but their supply chain? What types of things?
So I think a couple of different things come to mind. One is you need to make sure that you are manufacturing something that there's going to continue to be a market for. We've had a lot of clients that have been moving to manufacturing PPE or gloves or face masks or things that are not their normal product line, but are needed in the healthcare setting. And there's just the demand requirement, which is more of a business issue, but there's also a regulatory approval requirement. FDA loosened some regulations for a period of time to allow many companies to do that kind of work, but normally you'd have to get a regulatory approval, like a license or permit. So you just need to be mindful of that if you're going to do it over the long run. And I would check with an attorney with expertise in that area.
You know, we were talking before the show a little bit about the financial health check-in, and you know that sort of goes without saying. If you haven't checked your health by now, you're probably reminded as to where you are. But what I wonder is, you know, with some of the rules being relaxed with respect to COVID, or whether there's some kind of a major force majeure issue because you can't get supplies. With that type of thoughts, what might you suggest a business owner consider with respect to contracts and being aware if somebody's rushing to give you, what was the story? Somebody had like a $60 million contract for face masks with the Department of Veteran, and they didn't deliver anything.
Yeah, no, there's been a lot of those. You hear some of those high-profile fraud in New York. It's funny. I saw a LinkedIn post this morning from a mayor from a relatively big city in the Midwest that basically said, don't LinkedIn me, message me, or otherwise think that I'm going to give you a $5 million contract for face masks just because we're buddies on LinkedIn, something along those lines, which is good, right? I guess lessons are being learned. But to your point and to your immediate question, I think you need to be having conversations with those lenders, right? With maybe your investors, if you brought in other equity investors into your company, with your customers and with your employees, right? I think everyone is expecting life to be different. Some companies are doing very well, but I would say the majority of companies are hurting a little bit, right? So I think everyone expects that if not business as normal, and appreciates having upfront conversations because, you know, if your clients don't pay your bills, you can't pay your clients' bills. It's just a waterfall. And we're starting to see that with landlords, with rent, with et cetera. But I think people will give you discounts if you're upfront and have conversations with them at the beginning about your financial health and your situation and are basically treating them fairly. I think you're going to get a much different result if you just choose not to pay rent for 2 or 3 months and you don't communicate about it. I think you may have seen Red Robin just got sued by their landlord for not paying for 2 months. And they're a public company, right? They're not even a smaller mom and pop company. So everyone's hurting, but that's why it's important to have good upfront conversations with all of those people. And I think people are willing to work together, right? We're all in this to get through this together, but I think you got to be fair. So, so that I've been advising my clients to don't take the position of not paying, but to instead see how can we adjust the situation going forward. I think a lot of companies, and one tech company in particular that I work with, have realized they don't need as big of a lease as they have, right? So do they really want to pay for that lease for another 1.5 years or 2 years if they don't need it? And so, you know, my advice is basically don't not pay for your lease, right? Pay for your lease, but negotiate the size of the lease going forward, right? That gives the landlord an opportunity to find someone else to potentially sublet it, right? There's just other ways that you can deal with it where it doesn't result in litigation. And I'm not a litigator, and I hate litigation, and I advise clients, if they can, to stay away from it.
You know, I was thinking as you were talking about, so, you know, let's say that you're working with some kind of renegotiation, whether it's a lease or a loan or anything else, right? And everybody's kind of in a hurry right now, it feels like, to get, let's get the pain to go away. Let's go ahead and sign this. What thoughts might you suggest to the business owner that's got a modification in front of them as far as signing it or being thoughtful?
So I would see what the terms are, right? To see whether it's really advantageous to sign it now or it's more advantageous to be thoughtful because you don't know what the future's going to look like. But I've got a company that I've been talking with now that is dealing with like an SBA loan that didn't get treated like an SBA loan. And right now, right, there's certain benefits to them to be treated as an SBA loan with the bank, deferral of principal and interest. And there's a lot of benefits to them that they would otherwise get. But we've been measured, right? We haven't rushed into signing anything because kind of like PPP, these relief packages are changing, right? So we've definitely been negotiating with the bank for a period of around 3 or 4 weeks as to what we want. But we're trying to get the relief, all of the relief, right? Not the relief we're just entitled to now, as if we had an SBA loan, So that's what I'm doing in practice, is saying, well, wait a second, we're not just going to settle for what we currently understand the deal is, right? We want it as if it was a deal from the beginning, right? So bank, you need to work with us. And no, we're not going to accept your first offer, but we'll still continue the conversations with you to find something that'll work.
Yeah, I remember the very first part of the PPP loan. It was like the Monday, and talking to folks, and it was like there was this iterative interpretation of what it really meant. And I think, like the SBA is open, the SBA crashed. They did, they didn't, they should, they shouldn't. It's forgiven. It's, there was this, it was like standing on a watermelon seed. We don't really know where that thing's going. So, what thoughts might you have for the business owner that may have received a PPP loan? What should they be thinking about?
Yeah, well, it's changing, as you mentioned, daily, right? The biggest thing to be thinking about and continuing to think about, and by that I mean continuing to pay attention to the guidance, is the forgiveness aspects. So luckily, there was a fair amount of changes the first week or two on what constitutes forgiveness. There hasn't been as much since that original guidance was released on that. But this week, there was another very important point that we mentioned before we started talking, Bob, which is if you have borrowed less than $2 million, you're going to be subject to less scrutiny when it comes to the forgiveness of a loan as to larger companies. And I think the reason that we came to that guidance was there was some conflicting guidance given by the SBA and the Justice Department as to your ability to have access to capital from other sources. And so this is an easy way to address that for a lot of companies. I'm not saying that there was still certification that needed to be made, need to be true and in good faith, right? But there's going to be less scrutiny paid in the months and years to come if you got less than $2 million. So I would say that's the key. And then the other key is just how you're dealing with your employees, right? There's specific guidance about bringing them back by June 30th if you laid them off, and how much of a reduction in compensation that you can do. Those are still subsets of this forgiveness element, but they're very important things that you, your CPA, or your attorney, or somebody that's advising you needs to be well aware of.
I think about in the time of change, folks don't think sometimes very well when they're scared, in talking to the business owners, I have them as client, I'm a business owner as well, stepping back from the fear of the moment and taking some quiet time with people like and trust, that have worked with you when things weren't so strident, to say, let me just think about this more constructively and frame your questions, back up, think about it, get appropriate counsel, get your CPA, get your attorney, get Mike, get these folks involved. And so let's frame the problem better. And if you have multiple problems, let's frame each one and then prioritize the problem. And I think sometimes, in this environment, there's a rush to get away from the fear or pain, and I'm sure you get a few of those calls, Mike.
Yeah, I do. I think it's a fair observation. It's something that I myself have dealt with too, right? With my clients, right? How are they going to make it through this, right? I don't tell that to them when I'm on a call with them, but I worry on their behalf, right? There's a couple of things that I have helped me, right, when I'm dealing with that, and that I also tell my clients. One is have you heard of the Eisenhower box, Bob?
Not sure I have.
So I just happen to have it.
Oh, you just happen to have.
I really did. It's basically, there's a couple different categories: urgent, not urgent, important, not important. And if you're really struggling with something and you can't stop thinking about it, right? I look at this box and say, well, wait a second, is this urgent, important? And it kind of helps me decide, do I do something about it? Do I decide to do something later about it, right? Put it on my calendar. Do I delegate it and have somebody else on my team do it? Or is it really not important and not urgent, and I just need to keep thinking about it? So that's kind of a first step. The other thing, though, is I often tell clients, look, my advice to you is not one and done, right? You're thinking about this problem is not one and done. Even your counterparty that you're dealing with is not one and done. So let's talk about it. Let's think about it. And then let's circle up in a week or so and see if anything's changed, if we still have the same mindset, because most of the stuff we're dealing with is not urgent. It's really when we get stuck on our own head and our own way of thinking that we can cause problems, because we get trapped, right? We get stuck in a cycle of fear in the way that we think. And it paralyzes a lot of us from doing anything. So,
that do loop is what we used to call it in the military. You just kind of go faster and faster in a smaller circle, and I think about, there's a book I read recently. It's got an unfortunate title called The Road Less Stupid by Keith Cunningham. And he talks about thinking time and how you can carve out 45 minutes and you go and actually sit down and you start basically journaling everything that you can think of. One about the problem. Is the problem or is it the symptom? And if you can get past that, then go, okay, spend 45 minutes thinking of, why is it this way? What can I do? What do I think? And usually by the time you're done, you can prioritize the good thoughts versus the not so good ones, but it's a tool,
Yep.
And we talked about this a little bit before. I think about so many of the businesses that have pivoted, and they've pivoted, and it seems like everybody's in the PPE space. And, at some point in time, that curve is going to stop and roll over.
Right.
And then you're going to have a bunch of people that are still doing PPE into there's more supply than demand, which is what we're seeing in the oil field right now. So what would you suggest to those business owners, that have pivoted away from their core business model in the intervening time frame they're doing PPE? What might you advise them to think about as some metric or strategy to pivot back from PPE back to their core strength?
That's a good question. I would say your fellow business owners. I think a lot of people that are successful have a network, either through an organization, just friends, the community somehow, right, that they know other business owners, especially business owners in similar industries. It's when we're here in Colorado, I've been so impressed with how it's a give first mentality, right? Where people are willing to help other people, give them just some advice, some thoughts, some practical things that they've dealt with, or just introductions, right? Where it has nothing to benefit somebody of their own. They're really just giving for giving's sake. And so that's what I would say, is talk to other people in the industry that are either doing, continuing the PPP, but slightly modifying, right? Or people that are in a similar just bucket as they are, right? Where demand's dropped for their services or their consumer product, and see, well, what do I do? I mean, I was working with a client that was going to launch an outdoor clothing company that decided to pivot to a natural foods company, right? And they were basically 2 days from ordering product from China when everything went to hell in a handbasket. And then they've made a pivot now in this next month to do a totally different type of company. And I think that's going to work, right? One, because there's some demand with food, with all the runs on grocery stores, et cetera. But two, because I think he found that there's a really big community here, especially in the Boulder area, that deal with natural foods. So he's been able to find a great way to transition his business. And I think it's going to be for the long term too. I don't think he's going back to actually the other business.
I was struck by what you were saying, and I was thinking, we all worry about the things that we worry about and have some inkling of, as you're looking down the road and you go, so we've got the current problem. And, usually folks can kind of say, well, I think I understand where the next problem is. If you're looking around the corner, what worries you about what's coming around the corner for these companies that you serve?
That's a really good question. So, and one I'm going to have to think more about, Bob. But what immediately comes to mind is just, I think it's two things. One is, 70% of our economy is consumer spending. And we've had an artificially propped up industry, consumer products industry just generally, in the sense that government has funded this payroll right through the end of June. So I think there's some consumer spending that wouldn't have happened otherwise, which keeps basically the entire economy and the consumer products industry. So I'm worried, and I know this is still in the sort of immediate to short term, but I'm wondering over the longer term how that plays out, right? How from July to the end of this year that starts to play out with consumer spending mechanisms, with just overall lower spending in the economy. But I think too, this pandemic has really shown how our supply chain in the U.S. is really screwed up, right? Whether it be pork, beef, chicken, right? Whether it be from China, products that are made in China, like we've seen a lot of weaknesses that I don't think a lot of us even knew existed here in the U.S. So that's a longer term problem that I don't know how we deal with, right? Does that mean manufacturing moves to Mexico? What does that mean and what does that look like? I don't really know. So those are the two that immediately come to mind. Curious if you have any thoughts though, Bob, about what's worrying you in the longer term.
Well, I think about, the WeWork phenomena, where you get in with all of your best buddies, in a big working space together. And I think that was a dubious business model to start with, but it looks like the interest for everybody to go pile into a room with each other is probably going to wane. I think about, Denver has a robust restaurant community. I mean, it's just amazing. Every little suburb around the place has a restaurant or multiple restaurants in them. And I think about most of them ran on passion and thin margins. And if you're distance where you can have a quarter of your normal seating, short of a vaccine coming out in a hurry, how many people can do takeout? I don't really know.
Right.
I think about the just-in-time inventory issues. If you're a manufacturer of any description and you've got just-in-time, which was touted to be the thing, then your supply chain's interrupted. Or for the guy that's raising chickens, I mean, if your slaughterhouse poops out, you can't hold the chickens for months and months and months.
Yeah.
You got a 3-year-old chicken. I mean, what's that going to look like?
Right. Right.
So I don't think I've seen
It's
a
gonna be a
3-year-old
turkey.
chicken.
Chicken's the new turkey.
Yeah. So I think about, the centralization issues, and I think about the business owners, how do you look around the corner? Is my business viable? Yes or no? Is it dead, on arrival? What do I do about that? How do I protect my family and all my work? And if my business is not going to survive, what do I do next? Can I pivot? Can I go? Is there going to be a business for sale, that I can go in and participate? Because there's a lot of baby boomer businesses, I think, that in '08, they go, man, I should have sold in '07, and they said, we're going to hold on. And things got so good, for a long time. They says, well, I don't need to sell right away. They're probably looking back going, again. So I think about those issues,
right.
And I think about, almost everybody that's a top performer that I'm aware of, they bring coaches on board, as sports psychologists, people that teach how to drive, teach how to putt. I clearly need those guys because I don't play golf, but I think about in these times, the quality of the folks that you surround yourself with to make really informed and good decisions. Folks might say, I want to save some money in this time because I'm short. My sense of that is there's probably not a better time because it's a whole lot cheaper to do this now than litigate about it later, is my sense about this. I would like to think that this will fade away into the memory banks as just a really bad one-off and we get a vaccine soon. But in the event that that's not true, I think manufacturing is going to come home. I think having a service-based economy is an interesting experiment that was proven to have some holes in it.
I think it's really hard to understand how so much has changed in such a short period of time, and to be able to understand what it's going to look like going forward. It's sort of anyone's guess, but everything that you mentioned, I definitely see. And the people that are really well positioned and good business leaders are going to actually end up doing great. I just saw a story about a brand in Salt Lake City that they were a consumer product company, demand dropped off, but they had warehouse and manufacturing space and were friends with another company whose demand took off. So they loaned all their customer service representatives, they loaned their entire space to this other company. And they're still two separate companies, but it's thrown a huge lifeline to them. And they have another, a huge advocate and consumer base that's going to be looking at their products, all because that business leader, and this is Cotopaxi is the name of the company. It's a great company, but their business leader was listening to a podcast or was friends with somebody that really challenged him about the types of leaders there are that come out of this crisis and what kind of a person are you going to be. And he said, you know what? I have been scared. I have been not sure what to do, but we're just going to try something. And he made that phone call, and it totally changed his business.
I was thinking as you were chatting, do you think, let's say that, I'm that company that has a really good service warehouse department, but my demand is dried up. And there's a small company over here that needs this asset because their sales have taken off. Do you think you're going to see an uptick in mergers?
So I think we'll see not an uptick overall. I think what we will see is people that are, especially in smaller companies, you have people that work together, right, to benefit both companies for a period of time. And I think we'll definitely see more of that collaboration. I do think we'll see more in the way of selective acquisition. So, very big public companies that have a lot of resources that have been afraid to buy some companies because of the run up in value and the way private equity firms have outbid a lot of other companies. I think now it's going to turn into a buyer's market from a seller's market. And so you're going to see a lot of really, really large companies buying out a lot of smaller companies because they've got the cash and the resources and can weather the storm a lot better. So I do think we'll see definitely more of those types of transactions.
Yeah, in fact, I saw today where I think Facebook bought Giphy. So the GIFs, yep, they bought them, I think, for $400 million today in the news. What do you, as you look across the startup community, and the venture capital community in Denver, what do you think is going to be the upshot for those guys, given this environment?
So I think we'll see similar dynamics where investors have better, and I'm already seeing this in a lot of transactions where the values ascribed to companies over the months prior to versus post pandemic, or now, I guess, have dropped 25 to 30%. So if you were going to do a financing at $5 million pre-pandemic, now you can probably get a $4 million valuation for your tech company startup. And that's just the market, how the market's changed, and there's less capital to go around. But I do think that we're still seeing very well-positioned tech companies get funding, right? Funding in that private market tends to lag behind public by 6 to 12 months, just generally, historically speaking. I think it's not as long this time around, but I do think it'll lag somewhat. So there will be less deals to get done, but there's still plenty of capital because there's been billions of dollars raised in venture capital. And there was actually a recent article too about more and more companies are in the Midwest. So not just here in the Rocky Mountain region, but the Midwest region. There's lots of different venture capital funds and tech companies that are getting started and are getting funded. But you're going to have to set yourself up above every other startup, right? You're going to have to say either you've gotten a lot of traction, you've done it being bootstrapped. You're going to have to still, in this pandemic, show not only those good metrics, but how you've also been able to transition with the pandemic.
That would call into question the earnout language. If you don't think you're going to get what you want for your company, then the earnout discussion gets to be interesting, doesn't it?
It does. And I've actually heard a metric called EBITDA, which is earnings before interest, taxes, and COVID.
Yeah.
So trying to use that as a metric to sell your business, I'm skeptical it works, but we've seen people try to use it now.
Yeah. As we go through here, I think we could probably chat for some time. The point behind having you on is you and I've talked in the past. You've been active and you have vast experience in this field. And I thought it was really important for the business owners that, we serve and talk to and listen to the podcast and others to start, if they weren't thinking about some of these things, to start thinking about, the HR side of the house, what you're doing in financing, contracting, if you've got a PPP loan, what should you be thinking about, and before I wrap this up, Mike, how do people find you? How do they reach out to you on social media?
Yeah, sure. So I have a LinkedIn profile, and Mike Dill is, I don't know the exact address. I can get it to you, Bob, but you can find me just by searching me on LinkedIn. We're also, Holland Hart has a website. I've got a profile on the website too, but my phone number is 303-295-8097, and my email address is medill@hollandhart.com, and be happy to chat with anybody that is a business owner and has some of these questions that they're dealing with, because There's a lot of issues that we've seen over the last month and a half that we've been helping people work through.
I think as the situation mutates, or whatever the hell we've got going on now, I think the challenges that we have today may well not be the same challenges we have a month from now. And I think as we iterate and work through, you taking time out of your afternoon to come on and share generously with your experience and wisdom is greatly appreciated, and I hope for the listeners that they found, maybe a little less angst by some of the advice and commentary that we've had here. And, for Mike's a pleasure to work with and as a real bright guy. And so, in wrapping, Mike, I guess, is there anything that I should have asked you that I failed to ask that you think would be important for the business owner to consider?
So nothing immediately comes to mind, but I would just say that I think one of the things that I've found personally, and you may have too, is there's a little less noise going on these days. I mean, there was a lot of immediate noise, especially when the pandemic happened, but being myself, working from my home office for the past almost 2 months now, gave me a little bit more time to sit back and reflect and think about my business, right? Think about my family, think about things that I think in the long run are really important. And so I think that's something that people have a chance to do now, right? To sit back and say, wait a second, in the grand scheme of life, what's really important, right? Family is definitely the most important. I obviously want to provide for my family. I want to be a good person. And I think in the grand scheme of things, that's one of the lessons that I've learned and I've seen that I'm very proud of, right? Is how the whole reason we're doing this, right, is to help save lives, right? Help to keep people safe, help basically to look out for each other. And that's something we've been missing a lot, I think, in the US, especially in the media and a lot of the debates. And I'm very glad to see that. So I think that's something that people should think about in the context of their business, right? Take this time. It's a time that we may never get back in our lifetime. These pandemics happen, seems like, pretty rarely. So let's take advantage of it and see how you can learn lessons and apply things to your life that you'll be a better person at the end of the day when we go back to whatever this new normal looks like.
Well, I guess to wrap it up, and character is easily, doesn't require much character in really good times. Character is truly defined about how you behave when things are less than good, and doing like you're doing now, stepping up and serving, and sharing is really a testament, I think, in this time to character. We see lots of character, right now, people that are stepping out and helping, and I think that's going to be one of the bright spots that are coming out of all of this event. So, Mike, I really appreciate you coming on and sharing what you know and helping out. So, with that being said, thank you for taking time. And the dog and the kids and all that stuff, I mean, they got the memo, and they didn't come up and bark or anything during the middle of this.
They did.
Yeah, if your kids came up barking, we'd be worried. Time. Yeah. So,
well, it was been my pleasure, Bob. I appreciate the invitation.
You bet. Thanks for inviting me into your home, huh? Take care.
Yep. All right. Thanks.